Okay, now that we've got our stitches on our needle, if you're making the baby size, you should have 36 stitches. If you're making the child size, you should have 44 stitches. And if you're making the adult size, you should have 58 stitches. I'm making the adult size, so I've got 58 stitches. You'll notice that when you do the long tail cast on, you'll have both the tail and the working yarn here at the same end of your work. When you start, um, both yarns will be on the left here. When we knit and we start a new row, we need our working yarn to be at the right hand side. So we're going to turn our work around and we're going to ignore our tail for now. This is the short one, so we don't want to accidentally knit with that. It happens sometimes. We don't want to do it today. We've got our working yarn here, which is attached to our ball of yarn, and we're going to start knitting with that. So I've got all my stitches lined up here, and I've got both needles ready to go. And I'm using my 6.5mm needles. So they're the smaller size. We knit the brim on a smaller size needle so that it'll be a little bit tighter and stay in shape as we're stretching it over our head. So row 1 on our pattern tells us that we're going to knit 1 and purl 1, and we're going to repeat that all the way around. So we knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way to the end of our row. So I'm going to knit 1. I'm going to enter my needle into the left-hand side of the front of that stitch. And I'm going to bring my yarn around anti-clockwise around the back of the right-hand needle, between the two needles. I'm going to lift this left-hand needle up and over, drawing that newly wrapped piece of yarn through. Now I can release the stitch that's on my left-hand needle, take it over, and now we've knit 1 stitch. Because my next stitch is purl, I need to have my yarn at the front of my work. So I need to bring the yarn between the two needles, not over the top of the needle, but between the two needles. So now my working yarn is at the front of my work, ready to purl a stitch. When I purl, I'm going to enter from the right-hand side of the needle and keep my needle, the right-hand side of the stitch, and keep my needle at the front of the work. I'm now going to wrap my yarn. Sorry, my hand was right in the way there. I'm now going to wrap my yarn around that front needle from right to left, and then lift the left-hand needle up and over. And now I can release that left-hand needle stitch. And now I've done a purl stitch. I need to now take my yarn to the back of the work in order to have it ready to knit. So I'm going to take my yarn back between the two needles. Now I'm ready to knit another stitch. So I enter the stitch from the left-hand side through the front and keep my needle at the back. I take my yarn and wrap it from left to right, the same way I entered the stitch. I lift my left-hand needle up and over. Now I can release that left-hand needle. So far we've got a knit, a purl, and a knit. So we're ready to do another purl stitch. I bring my yarn to the front between the two needles. I enter the stitch from the right to the left, keeping my right-hand needle at the front, just where my yarn is as well. And then I wrap the yarn from the right to the left around that front needle. Then I lift my left-hand needle up and over. Now I can release my left-hand needle, and I've done another purl. Take my yarn to the back between the needles. I'm going to knit another stitch. Then I can purl another stitch. Then I can knit another stitch. Then I can purl another stitch, I'll try and keep my hand out of the way when I do that. It's a little bit tricky with the angle of the camera to do that, but let's see if I can manage it. With a pearl, there we go. That's better. We're going to do this all the way to the end, and just keep in mind that your uh, first row is always the slowest because you're working in brand new cast on stitches and they're always a little bit awkward. Your next row will be much, much easier. And we probably won't really start to see the pattern of the ribbing develop in this first row, but it becomes much more apparent in the second row. And don't forget to bring your yarn to the front when you're purling and a yarn to the back when you're knitting. You'll soon find out if you haven't done that because you get a big crisscross. I'll show you what I mean. If I try and purl without bringing my yarn to the front, so I just try and purl, my yarn has to come over the top of the needle because I haven't brought it to the front. So it's still at the back and I'm trying to purl. Then I get a bit of this action happening. You can see I've got a lot of action happening on the top of the needle because not only has my yarn had to come across the top of the needle, but it's pulled up my previous knit stitch as well. So I'll just undo that so I can correct it. And you might not notice it straight away, but you'll see it when you come back on your next row. And it will be really frustrating because you might not know how to fix it yet. It's actually really easy to fix on the return row, but if you've never done it before, it's not necessarily that easy. We're more than halfway on our row now. How are you going? Just about there. And we should have a purl as our last stitch if everything goes right, and we did. Beautiful. So our first row is done. So now that we've finished that row, our first row, our yarn is once again at the left-hand side, but we need it to be over here. So we're going to turn our work around. Get our little tail out of the way. And we start all over again. So row 2 and every subsequent row of our band is exactly the same, which is nice and handy. We're going to start with a knit stitch, and you'll find this row is much easier than the first row. So our knit stitch again is entering into the left-hand side of the stitch with our right-hand needle at the back, and our yarn goes around from left to right with our back needle there, and we lift our left-hand needle up and over and then release that stitch. Now our next stitch is a purl, so we're going to bring our yarn to the front between the two needles. Then we enter the stitch from right to left and keep our right hand needle at the front. Then our yarn goes around that front needle from right to left, and we lift our left hand needle up and over, and then release that stitch. Our next stitch is a knit, because remember we're repeating knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way down. So our yarn needs to go to the back between the needles. We enter our stitch from left to right. Our next stitch is a purl, a knit, and a purl. And right now you should be able to start seeing your rib pattern developing. Let's take a look. Let's have a look here. We can start seeing that rib pattern developing already. We've got these nice columns of knit intersected with these columns of purl that are dipping down into our work. And if you get lost in your sequence, you can read your work. These columns here with the little V's are knits. So the knit stitches need knit stitches into them. And then the columns with the little bumps, these horizontal bumps, you can see that horizontal bump is a purl stitch. So if you come across a purl stitch, you know it needs a purl stitch into it. We've got a little V here, so we know that's a knit stitch that needs to be knit into. So let's take a look at what's happening in our next stitch. Can we see? We can see a little V. So we know that this is a knit stitch that needs to be knit into. So let's have a go. Our yarn's already at the back, so let's get going. A knit stitch. When we bring our yarn to the front, we can see a horizontal bump, sort of, and we're going to purl into it. A knit stitch, a purl stitch, and we're going to do this all the way to the end. Shuffle our stitches up closer to the end of our needles so they're a bit easier to access and we're not stretching our work. Let's have a look. Yep, we're getting some nice rib fabric, exactly what we're after. So this is our second row of rib, and we've got to do a total of 4. Let's have a look here. We're a little over halfway. We're just about to the end. And I'm keeping in mind to push my stitches on my right hand needle down a bit so that I can do my stitch on the whole width of the needle and not right up here on the tips, so that my stitches are all the same size. There we are. Got our second row done and it's looking great. Turn my work around so that my yarn is back on the right hand side and I'm ready to start row 3. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and purl. And here we can really see the fabric. It's become much more obvious now that we've got 3 rows happening. We can really see those knit columns and those purl columns, and we can really identify which stitch we need to do next. We can see those V's. We can see that's definitely a knit stitch. And we know if that's a knit stitch, well, this has to be a purl stitch. It's nice and easy to read this sequence. So let's keep going. And we'll just shuffle our stitches up closer to the end of our needles so we're not stretching our work. And so they're easier to get to. And you can see you can get into a bit of a rhythm with bringing the yarn backwards and forwards for your knits and your purls. I quite like doing 1 by 1 rib because of that rhythm you can get into. And here we go. We're more than halfway on our 3rd row. Wiggle those stitches up along my needle. Let's get in for a purl. And remembering you should always be ending with a purl stitch, and then you know things are still on track. And we've got 3 rows of rib. Let's turn our work around and start on our last row of rib. Whoops, I did some knit stitches there, so I'm just going to knit backwards for a second. It's meant to be a purl stitch. There we are. Fixed. So once again, we're doing knit 1, purl 1, all the way to the end, and then we'll have our brim done. So let's go through these stitches again so we can make sure we know exactly what's happening. We'll do a knit stitch. So enter through the left-hand side. Our needle goes at the back, and then yarn from the left to the right around that back needle. Then our left-hand needle goes up and over, and then you can release that left-hand stitch. Our yarn comes to the front between the 2 needles so that we can do a purl stitch. Our needle enters from right to left and stays at the front, just the same place our yarn is, and then our yarn goes from right to left around that front needle. Then our left needle goes up and over and can be released. Yarn goes to the back between the needles. We do a knit stitch, yarn comes to the front. We do a purl. We keep going like that all the way to the end. we're just about finished our fourth row of rib, and that will be the end of our brim. Beautiful. Look at that. Looks amazing. Fantastic. You can really see that rib fabric showing there with our columns of knits and our columns of pearls. Beautiful. Hopefully yours is coming along nicely as well. And I'll see you in the next segment.